Okay, so ready to dive deep into logic? Today we're tackling arguments, the building blocks of like any clear thinking, right? And I think this is super useful for everyone, but especially if you've got exams coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And in philosophy, we use logic all the time as a tool to break down, uh, analyze ideas.
Hmm.
Yeah, alongside thinking up hypotheses and figuring out what conditions are necessary for something to be true, even using thought experiments.
Right, right.
So it's a really systematic approach to like investigate and test those really foundational ideas in any field, really.
It's so easy to just think, oh yeah, this is obviously true. But so many of those like basic principles, they really need arguments to back them up.
Right.
And, logic gives you that framework to really think through those supporting reasons and not just rely on gut feeling.
Totally. And it's not just some, academic thing either.
Yeah.
Lewis Carroll actually pointed this out, that when you understand logic, you can spot bad reasoning like everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
In the stuff you read, what people are saying, even in your own thoughts.
Hmm.
It's all about sharpening that analytical mind.
So in this deep dive, we're going to first just define what an argument is. Like, what are we even talking about? And then how to present it clearly in standard form.
Right.
Then we'll get into what makes an argument convincing, looking at inductive, abductive, and the most important for logic, I'd say deductive reasoning.
Right.
And then we'll really focus on validity.
Yeah.
Like what makes a deductive argument actually work
Mhm.
and how we can tell if an argument is valid based on its structure.
So let's start with like the super basics. What is an argument? Basically, it's a bunch of propositions.
Yeah.
And propositions are statements that can be either true or false.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
They're usually expressed in like declarative sentences, and they represent like what we believe or what we're claiming.
Mm.
And importantly, questions, commands, requests, they're not propositions
Right.
because they can't be true or false.
Yeah.
Now, within an argument, we have premises. Those are the reasons or the evidence. And we have a conclusion, which is like the claim we're trying to support
Yeah.
with those premises.
Right. So it's not just like a random collection of statements, right?
Exactly.
There's a relationship where the premises should lead you to accept the conclusion.
Right.
And to really analyze how strong an argument is logically, it's super helpful to put it into standard form, which just means listing the premises first and then the conclusion,
Yeah.
usually with some word like therefore or something.
Yeah. Yeah. In real life, arguments are rarely, presented so neatly.
Of course not.
Like the conclusion might come first. The premises might be all over the place.
Yeah.
So converting it into this standard form is super important for any logical evaluation.
Mm.
And, our materials actually give us some nice, clear examples.
Yeah.
Like the musician argument. All musicians can read music. John is a musician, therefore John can read music.
Right.
Yeah.
And in that standard form, you can clearly see the two premises leading to the conclusion.
Yeah. And we also have that spiders example, which shows that we might need to reorder things and kind of spot those keywords that tell us what's a premise and what's a conclusion.
Exactly.
So the original sentence was, spiders have 8 legs, so they can't be insects, because if they were insects, they'd have 6 legs.
Right.
So we can see, so that's like our conclusion indicator.
Mm.
And because that introduces a premise,
Right.
so we put it in order. Premise 1, spiders have 8 legs.
Mm.
Premise 2, if spiders were insects, they'd have 6 legs. And then the conclusion, spiders cannot be insects.
Exactly. And the Cluedo example actually illustrates this with a bit of a more complex argument.
Mm.
So it originally says, Mrs. White must have committed the murder because it was either her or Reverend Green.
Yeah.
And if you'd done it, it would have been in the kitchen, and it wasn't.
Right.
So again, we see that because, and we can break that down into premise 1. Either Mrs. White or Reverend Green must have committed the murder.
Mm-hmm.
Premise 2, if Reverend Green had done it, it would have been in the kitchen.
Okay.
Premise 3, the murder has not been committed in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And then the conclusion, Mrs. White must have committed the murder.
Okay, so now we can like identify an argument and put it in this clear structure.
Right.
But what makes an argument good?
Yeah.
It all comes down to whether the premises actually give us solid reasons to believe the conclusion right.
Right.
Whether the conclusion follows from the premises.
Yeah. And that follows from is not like a one-size-fits-all concept.
No.
We have inductive, abductive, and deductive inferences.
Okay, let's break those down.
Right. So inductive arguments, they draw general conclusions from specific observations.
Okay?
Like the Lees example, where we see a lot of Flemish students, they speak Dutch and French. So we conclude that all Flemish students must be bilingual.
Right.
So the premises make the conclusion likely,
Yeah.
but it's not guaranteed, right?
There's guaranteed.
There might be exceptions.
Right.
And then we have abductive reasoning, which aims for the most plausible explanation.
Yeah.
Like the houses example, where we see high rent in Rotterdam, and we say, well, that's probably because there's a high demand.
Right.
There's a reasonable explanation.
Yeah.
But other factors could be involved as well.
Of course.
And then finally, we have deductive arguments, which are really the heart of formal logic.
Right.
So in a valid deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true.
Okay.
There's no way you can have true premises and a false conclusion. Like the no free will argument. If determinism is true, then there's no free will.
Okay.
Determinism is true, therefore there's no free will.
Right.
So the conclusion just necessarily follows from the premises here.
So while inductive and abductive arguments, they can be good in terms of like being plausible or strong support, logic traditionally focuses on this deductive goodness, which we call validity.
Well, let's dive deeper into that then.
So what makes a deductive argument valid?
It's valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false at the same time. So think of it this way. In every scenario where the premises hold, the conclusion must also hold.
Okay.
So the conclusion is kind of like contained within the premises logically.
Right. And it's really important to separate this idea of validity from soundness.
Yes, definitely.
A sound argument is one that's not only valid, like the logic works,
Right.
but it also has all true premises, so it's valid and it's based on reality.
Exactly. And we can actually go back to that musician argument. All musicians can read music.
Yeah.
John is a musician, therefore John can read music.
Okay.
So the structure is valid. Like, if those premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true.
Right.
However, that first premise is not true.
No, not all musicians can read music.
Exactly. Like, think of those self-taught musicians,
Yeah.
People who play by ear.
Right, right.
So the argument is valid, but it's not sound.
Okay. And another example is that Socrates' argument, Socrates died of poison, or by accident. Socrates did not die of poison, therefore Socrates died by accident. Again, the logic here works right.
The structure is valid, yeah.
If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to follow. But as we know, historically, Socrates actually died from poison as a form of execution.
Oh.
So that first premise is not true.
Yeah.
The argument's not actually sound.
Interesting.
But then there's the study argument, which is you are studying economics or philosophy. You are not studying philosophy, therefore you are studying economics.
Right.
Now, this one is likely both valid and sound for our listeners.
Yeah, probably.
Because if you're here listening to this, you're probably interested in these topics.
Now let's talk about enthymemes.
Enthymemes. Okay.
These are arguments that are like presented in a shortened form,
Okay.
often with a premise that's not explicitly stated.
Mm-hmm.
They might seem invalid on the surface, but they actually rely on this hidden assumption to make them logically complete.
Interesting. Okay.
Like the abortion argument is a classic example. Ending a person's life is murder. Abortion ends a fetus's life, therefore abortion is murder. So logically, there's a piece missing here, right?
Yeah.
The unstated premise is that a fetus is a person.
Right. Right.
And if we add that in, the argument becomes structurally valid. But whether that added premise is actually true is, a whole other debate.
That's a huge philosophical question, yeah.
Exactly.
And we also see this in the inflation argument, right?
Right.
If inflation stays high, our market share will shrink. Inflation will stay high, so we'll have to fire people. So to make this deductively valid, we need that missing link.
Right.
Which is if our market share shrinks, we'll have to fire people.
Yeah.
And then whether that statement is actually true for their business is a separate question that has to do with soundness.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that formal logic mainly deals with validity, that structural integrity of the argument.
Yeah.
Whether the premises are actually true is something that other fields deal with.
Okay.
Like the atheism argument.
Right.
If God exists, there's no evil. There is evil, therefore God doesn't exist. Logically, this is a valid argument.
Yeah.
But whether those premises are true, and therefore whether the argument is sound, is a matter that's debated in theology and philosophy of religion.
So we know what a valid argument is, but how do we actually show that an argument is valid?
Right. Good question.
Our sources point out two main approaches.
Okay.
First, we have the semantic approach. This involves looking at the meaning of the statements in the argument.
Okay. So you argue that because of what the premises mean, if they're true, the conclusion must also be true. One technique here is reductio ad absurdum.
Oh, yeah. Proof by contradiction.
Exactly. You assume the premises are true and the conclusion is false.
Right.
And then you show that this leads to a contradiction, something that's logically impossible. And And that demonstrates that the initial assumption of a false conclusion with true premises can't be right.
Yeah.
So the argument must be valid.
Okay. And then the second approach is proof theory.
Right.
And here you show that the argument follows a known valid argument form or can be derived from the premises using these established rules of logic. And this is where the idea of formal validity comes in.
Right. So formal validity means that an argument is valid simply because of its structure. To understand this, let's look at the payoffs argument.
Okay.
If John gets €4, he chooses left. John doesn't choose left. Therefore, John doesn't get €4. In the bankruptcy argument, if inflation rises, we go bankrupt. We are not bankrupt. Therefore, inflation hasn't risen.
Okay.
Now, these arguments, they talk about different things, but they share this underlying structure.
Right. And that shared structure is what we call the argument form.
Exactly.
And in these cases, they both fit the pattern of modus tollens. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P.
Right. And P and Q here are like placeholders for any proposition.
Yeah.
So the validity of modus tollens comes from this form itself. Doesn't matter what those specific statements P and Q represent.
Right. This highlights something super important. Logic isn't about the specific content of an argument.
Yeah.
It's about that structural integrity.
Exactly. We get to this logical form by abstracting away the details.
Yeah.
And focusing on those logical terms, words like if, then, not, and, or, all, some.
Okay.
It's like recognizing grammatical structures in sentences.
Yeah.
And we can distinguish between propositional logic, which deals with how complete propositions connect, and predicate logic, which looks inside those propositions at the subjects and the predicates.
Right.
So for now, we're sticking to propositional logic.
Okay.
But yeah, so when an argument is formally valid, it means any argument with the exact same logical structure will also be valid. And this validity comes from the meaning of those logical terms, like not and if then.
Okay.
We also see this with other named valid forms, like disjunctive syllogism, either alpha or beta, not alpha, therefore beta.
Okay.
And modus ponens, if alpha, then beta, alpha, therefore beta.
Right. And that budget cuts argument. If budget cuts happen, there will be a strike. Budget cuts will happen, therefore there will be a strike.
Right.
That's a clear example of modus ponens.
Now, it's important to be careful because some arguments can look like valid forms, but they're not actually valid.
Are tricky.
Like the division of labor argument, if we divide labor efficiency increases, we don't divide labor. Therefore, efficiency doesn't increase. So it kind of looks like modus ponens.
Yeah.
But it's actually committing a fallacy called denying the antecedent. Just because if P, then Q is true, doesn't mean that if P is false, Q must also be false.
Right.
You can't just flip it around like that.
And similarly, we got to be careful with arguments that look like modus tollens.
Yeah.
Like that nationalization one argument. If left is in charge, the railways are nationalized, therefore left is in charge.
Okay. And nationalization two. If railways are nationalized, trains are late, therefore railways are nationalized.
Right. These are both invalid.
Yeah, they commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent.
Oh.
So just because the consequence is true doesn't mean the thing that supposedly leads to it is also true. Like in nationalization one, the fact that the railways are nationalized doesn't automatically mean left is in charge.
Right. Other parties could have nationalized them.
Exactly.
Okay, so modus tollens, it's a powerful tool even in philosophical arguments.
Yeah, definitely.
Like the transplant thought experiment, which argues against a simple view of utilitarianism, can be framed as modus tollens. If utilitarianism demands maximizing overall happiness above all else, then we should harvest David's organs to save 5 others. We should not harvest David's organs. Therefore, utilitarianism in this simple form is not correct.
Right, so the conclusion follows logically from those premises.
Yeah. So to recap, the key valid propositional argument forms we talked about are disjunctive syllogism, modus ponens, and modus tollens.
Right.
But remember, some arguments are valid because of their predicate form,
Right.
which deals with terms like all, some, none, and the properties of objects.
Exactly.
But the musician argument, it's valid, but not because of its propositional form. Its validity comes from its predicate form, which is for every X, if X is a musician, then X can read music. John is a musician, therefore John can read music.
And some arguments are valid simply because of the definitions of the non-logical terms they use.
Okay.
For example, Jane is a widow, therefore Jane's husband is deceased. This is valid because the word widow means a woman whose husband has died.
Right.
And similarly, this shape is a triangle. Therefore, this shape has three sides,
Okay.
is valid based on the definition of a triangle.
Right, so the meaning of the words themselves can make an argument valid. And remember those logician arguments from the beginning, logician 1 and logician 2.
Yeah.
Their validity or invalidity came from their logical form.
Right. Logician 1 had a valid form,
Hmm.
and logician 2 had that invalid form of affirming the consequent.
Right, and as we said, the formal validity or invalidity is independent of whether the premises themselves are actually true or false.
Exactly. Logic really gives us the tools to break down the structure of reasoning.
Yeah.
Understanding these core concepts, like what is an argument, how to put it in standard form, different types of inferences, the difference between validity and soundness, those key valid argument forms, and the concept of logical form in propositional and predicate logic.
Yeah.
It gives you this powerful framework to evaluate any argument you encounter.
It really does, whether you're studying or just, living your life.
Exactly.
So now that you have these logical tools, think about all those arguments you hear every day. How many rely on hidden assumptions or have shaky structures?
Good question.
How can you apply this to your own thinking and to the arguments you come across?
And don't forget, you can find a full summary of all these concepts and some practice tests to help you really master this over at gradeguru.nl.
Fantastic place to brush up on your logic skills.
Definitely.
All right, that's our deep dive into logic.
Thanks for listening.
Catch you next time.